my name is Morndas, and welcome back to The Prince and the Paper, where I stand here, talk about books, and try to validate my English degree. Today we'll be talking about J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, the story of one boy's struggle with impending adulthood. Ain't that just the way? Well, I'm here to tell you that this book is much more than a coming-of-age story. So grab your hunting hats and hold on to your childlike innocence, cause we're buckling in for the carousel ride of a lifetime. The Catcher in the Rye takes place in an unspecified year, but we can determine from the text that the story takes place sometime in the mid to late 1940s. We're also in Pennsylvania for a brief moment as Holden reflects upon his time at Pensy Prep, a boarding school that he was recently kicked out of for failing all of his classes except for English. However, almost the entirety of this story takes place over a 3-day period in New York City, which is apparently the only city that exists. In my Great Gatsby video, we talked about how even though Nick was narrating the story, he wasn't actually the story's protagonist. However, Catcher in the Rye gives us a more traditional first-person narrative in which the narrator is the protagonist, telling us a story that's more focused on themselves and less so on the actions of others. As I said earlier, our protagonist's name is Holden Caulfield. He's a 16-year-old boy who is characterized as intelligent, cynical, and emotionally sensitive. He struggles with both academic failure and the impending pressures of adulthood, something that a lot of teenagers can relate to. It's a real mystery why everyone has to read this book in high school. I mean, the poor kid's 16 and he already has gray hair and the world-weary vexation of like a John Steinbeck character or a barkeep from an Elder Scrolls game. He's heavily critical of superficiality and holds a special dislike in his heart for people he deems as sellouts or phony. Phonies! However, you'll notice that even though he hates these qualities in other people, he often displays them himself. That's what the kids call hypocrisy. Or, you know, just being a person. When it comes to a character like Holden, it's not really about whether or not he's likable. In fact, it's very possible that Salinger doesn't intend for us to like him at all. His flaws are what make him relatable, but it's his cynicism and his criticism of the adult world that create discomfort for many readers. Either way, Holden doesn't have to be considered likable to be well written, and I definitely recommend further analysis into his character, a subject that could honestly be its own video. Holden's siblings also play a significant role in the book. First, there's Phoebe, the only one to actually show up in the text. She's Holden's 10-year-old sister, and despite her age, she displays a maturity that Holden doesn't have. Her childlike innocence is also a source of joy for Holden, something that's really important to the book's overall theme, which we'll get to in just a minute. Second, there's Allie, Holden's younger brother, who died of leukemia 3 years before the novel takes place. Pretty important aspect of Holden's characterization, wouldn't you say? See, even though Allie never shows up in the text like Phoebe does, his death plays a major role in Holden's life and contributes to the slow deterioration of his mental health. And then there's DB, Holden's older brother, who he admires for his skills in writing, but also kind of resents because he thinks he's a phony. Other important characters include 2 of Holden's former teachers, Mr. Spencer and Mr. Antolini, and 2 girls for whom he has mixed feelings, Sally Hayes and Jane Gallagher. Pay attention to these characters and how their relationships with Holden affect the narrative. The overarching theme in Catcher in the Rye is the loss of innocence, or
getting old sucks!
You know, that time in your life when you realize that the passage of time never really stops, and as you grow older, it only gets faster and faster, and before you know it, you're in your 20s, wondering how exactly you're supposed to, maintain these expectations that are being put upon you, and life. This is why The Catcher in the Rye is so often taught as a coming-of-age story, but to view it that way would be taking the story at face value, something any budding literary analyst should never do. Or else. Trust me, if you dig just a little deeper, you'll understand why Holden makes a really unusual candidate for a coming-of-age story. Plus, we never saw one of these scenes.
But son, you're giving up on your dreams!
No, Dad, I'm giving up your dream. He separates childhood and adulthood in his mind as two completely separate entities that foil one another. Adulthood is this harsh world full of phonies, whereas childhood is a magical world of innocence and honesty. I mean, he's not exactly wrong, but he separates these two worlds because he's unwilling to admit that he's afraid of change. He's afraid of what he doesn't understand. You know, like filing taxes, or how mortgages work, or the plot of Inception. He's also afraid because, as I said earlier, the qualities that he hates in adults are the same qualities that he's starting to recognize within himself. The Catcher in the Rye also talks about themes such as alienation, grief, mental health, and many others, all of which contribute to this idea that it just plain sucks to grow up.
Getting old sucks!
Lots to look forward to, kids! When it comes to symbols, Salinger is hardly subtle. First, there's the ever-iconic red hunting hat. When you think of Holden, you think of this hat. He wants to be wearing it just as much as he feels self-conscious of it, which is a nod to the inner conflict he feels toward wanting to be separate from the crowd and wanting companionship with other people. This hat sucks.
Then take it off.
No! Another symbol that represents uniqueness and emotional expression is Allie's baseball glove, something that Holden keeps hidden.
That's a surprise tool that can help us later.
I'll give you a minute to think about that one. Next, we have the ducks in Central Park and the carousel, both of which symbolize childlike innocence and the idea of change. Both of these symbols also demonstrate a more youthful, innocent side of Holden, who begins to understand that not all change is permanent, much of it is simply cyclical. The Museum of Natural History is also a symbol because it demonstrates Holden's desire for things to stay exactly as they are. Holden finds comfort in the exhibits at the museum because they remain frozen in time. Nobody tell him about Night at the Museum. And lastly, we have the most important symbol in the book, the Catcher in the Rye. This symbol is inspired by a poem that appears in chapter 16, Coming Through the Rye by Robert Burns. If you want to read the poem, there's a link in the description. When Phoebe asks Holden what he wants to do with his life, Holden paints this picture of himself standing in a field of rye high up on a cliff. He's surrounded by children, and his job is to catch them before they fall over the edge. Before you get weirded out, let's unpack this. The field of rye represents Holden's utopian idea of childhood, whereas the cliff represents the descent into adulthood, something Holden is trying to prevent kids like Phoebe from ever experiencing. Thus, he is the Catcher in the Rye.
Wow!
Well guys, that about wraps it up for this month's book fight. Please let me know your thoughts on Catcher, and if you have a question about something that I didn't talk about, drop it in the comments below or feel free to find me on Twitter. Join me next month for a stabulous discussion on William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar.
Ooh.
I'm Morndas, and this has been The Prince and the Paper. See you next time.